One of the reasons that coaching has become so popular is it combines an awareness or a transformational experience that a client has in a session into action between the sessions. So basically, what we're saying is coaching is not just about good ideas, coaching is about actionable ideas that you can bring into your life and change your life. And so we see a fair amount of goal oriented coaches out there. And most often we find them in the executive coaching world, where a company is going to invest money with the expected result is that their employees are going to function at a higher level. And that's all well and good, and that's real work. What I want to talk to you about today is a situation with a client where the action is not going to necessarily be goal oriented, but there will be action nonetheless. And these clients generally come from the population of men and women in our culture who have achieved a certain degree of success and may have stable relationships, family units, etc., but they have this uneasy feeling of malaise. They don't get any satisfaction out of anything they do. Now, that kind of experience can be diagnosed as depression on the one hand or anxiety on the other hand, and sometimes that results in prescription medication. Now, if you want to get further into the efficacy of those drugs and what anxiety and depression is all about from a clinical perspective, there's a wonderful book written by a guy named Johann Hari, Hari, and it's called Lost Connections. And it will give you an overview of the efficacy of those drugs, and it's a real eye-opener. But what I want to focus on today is working with a client who is in that kind of malaise. So misery we understand about the phrase I've used, but what about that misery is fertile? Well, let me give you a couple of examples and it'll probably become clearer. A few years ago, I had a client who had a senior position in a mid-sized hedge fund in New York City. And he got into coaching because he was at the end of a 10-year relationship, which to his credit, he ended in an amicable way. But he also had this underlying feeling that he really didn't like the work he was doing anymore. He'd enjoyed it early on, but as they say, the thrill was gone. On the other hand, he had an apartment in New York and 2 vacation houses and all sorts of financial responsibilities. And he simply couldn't figure a way out of the situation he was in. And so there he sat in his misery. So one of the things we did, because he was really reluctant to work with dreams initially, was we did some active imagination. What is it that came to him when he cleared his mind and simply allowed his imagination to work? Well, it turned out that he had wanted to raise dogs, golden retrievers specifically, for a very, very long time. But he didn't even have a dog because of the hours that he worked. So this was an impossibility. And then lo and behold, he started getting dreams about dogs. And we would go into the dreams and ask the dogs why were they there. And the message universally over several months was, we're waiting for you. Now, this man was highly intelligent. And so one of the things that we worked on was finding everything out that one could find out about raising golden retrievers. Everything from genetic issues to how do you actually build a kennel to raise dogs, what kind of land do you need, all those details, right? All of which seemed to be a nice hobby because, again, there was a mindset that nothing was going to change and he was stuck in this financial bind where he had to make money to pay all these mortgages. And then his company went out of business. Oops. So here he was, and he was not irresponsible. He had money socked away, and he had these properties. And over the next 8 or 10 months, he disposed of those properties and bought himself the land and built a kennel and is now raising golden retrievers. Now, that's a very compressed story that took place over the period of 2 years. But it's a good example, I think, of actually paying attention to those aspects of our experience that we think are impossible. And when somebody is in, this fertile malaise, that is when we really need to pay attention to those things. Because obviously what was going on here is that this man was building the infrastructure before he made the change. And I find that more and more with clients, is that they may come into a situation where they don't really know what's next, but they tend to do things to set up a structure so that when the change comes, they're ready to go. So that's one example. The second example I want to give you is really a lesson to me as a coach. I had a referral for a guy who made initial contact and then didn't show up for a couple of weeks. And I sent out, a couple of inquiries and got no response. And I thought, well, this happens. And then I got a phone call. It was from this guy, and he basically said that he had fallen off a curb and broken both his wrists and torn up his ankle. And that's why he really hadn't been able to use his hands to even type an email to me. Okay, well, what was going on when he fell off this curb? Well, he'd just come out of a job interview internal to the company that he worked for. And he didn't know it at the time, or at least he didn't know it consciously at the time, but a week or so later he found out he didn't get the job. And it was something he had told himself he really wanted because it would have been a raise and he wouldn't have to work 2 jobs and all this kind of stuff. Okay, well, if you're anything like me and somebody presents that kind of information to you, you think, well, okay, we got an agenda here. We got all kinds of stuff we can work on. But fortunately, my higher self asked him if he'd ever had a dream or he had dreams around this particular period in his life. And he said, yeah, he had. And in the dream, he was a wolf and he was part of a wolf pack. And the wolf pack came across 2 or 3 much younger wolves. They were not even adolescents. And the wolf pack wanted to kill them and eat them. And he said, no, don't do that. I'll take care of them and I'll teach them. Okay. Well, as we got into the session, it became clear that what he was in his company really was a teacher. That was not his title, but he worked in an area of technology, and everybody came to him to ask him questions. As a matter of fact, the guy who got the job is the guy that he essentially trained. So here's somebody who has a job that doesn't have the title of teacher, doesn't see himself as a teacher, doesn't have a bachelor's degree, so that's another impediment for him to see himself in a particular way. But what we focused on really in his sessions was this identity of teacher. And it informed him in a way that no other experience ever had before, and he began to look for ways that he could actually embody that position as teacher. And the reason I'm telling you this is that oftentimes if we work with a client to pay attention to what they don't think is possible, it'll also educate us as a coach about not seizing on something that looks like we can have a goal-oriented experience here, how to get through an interview, what the issues are with authority, all that stuff, which is real, but his dreamer said was not to the point, and actually wasn't to the point. The point was his identity as a teacher. So what I'm suggesting to you here is that when people are in this kind of malaise, when they're in this kind of misery where nothing seems to really matter to them, even though they've done a lot of things that do matter, that the best thing to do for us as coaches is to really dive into the areas and arenas of their life that they think are sort of fantastical or will never happen, etc., etc. Because that's where the gold is. That's where they're going to discover what their real purpose is. And they will figure out, because they are naturally whole, creative, and resourceful, they will figure out how to embody what their soul's purpose is. I'm Sharon. I hope this was useful.